For more, we can bring in Nathalie Tocci to the show. She's the director of the Italian Institute for International Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me start by asking you what you think about how the Italian government has been handling this health crisis.
Well, clearly, Italy has been, after China and alongside South Korea and Japan, the next in line. So a lot of what Italy has done has been really based on trial and error. Now, given these circumstances and given that there was not one clear strategy to pursue, I think that ultimately the government has actually been acting in a fairly reasonable way. I mean, we see the results, which although are still extremely dramatic and obviously very, very painful in terms of the number of contagions, but above all, the number of deaths. What we essentially see is that the curve is flattening out, which essentially points in the direction of the fact that the closure measures that the government has taken are beginning to show their effectiveness. Now, obviously, as we move towards a phase in which the curve starts flattening out and then hopefully eventually it starts decreasing, in many respects, there is going to be the even harder set of choices to make in terms of when and how and what first sectors and age groups and regions does one begin to reopen. Because, of course, it's very likely that a very gradual reopening is not going to take place when we go down to zero new contagions. And therefore, it becomes extremely delicate and difficult to understand when and what and how is the right move to take in order to prevent a second relapse of this crisis from taking place. And of course, even in this, hopefully not second round, but in deciding how to move towards a reopening, Italy is likely going to be first in line. So all things considered, of course, mistakes have been made, but considering the fact that Italy was indeed at the forefront of this, I think broadly speaking, public opinion has been appreciative of the way in which the government has reacted.
Well, indeed, there will be like a whole new Pandora's box for the end of lockdowns. But what's your take on the EU's reaction to the coronavirus so far?
Well, I would say that it's basically sort of we're in stage 3, and hopefully there's going to be a stage 4 to this as well. Sort of, very first reaction, obviously very disappointing. So there was a long silence. There were uncoordinated unilateral measures, both in terms of putting up borders and temporary restrictions to the export of medical equipment. And then there was, of course, a first full step by the president of the European Central Bank. So this, in a sense, phase 1, which was a couple of weeks ago, disappointing. Phase 2, encouraging. We saw a commission stepping up with its 37 billion. We saw the relaxation of the Stability Pact rules, and perhaps most significantly, we saw the European Central Bank stepping in with over a trillion of temporary asset purchases. So extremely significant. Now we're in a stage 3, and it's a bit of a make it or break it movement for Europe because, of course, there has been very deep divisions and polarization over the questions of moving towards Eurobonds or Corona bonds. How Europe will ultimately fall on the two sides of this divide will, in my view, probably represent, even if it's a highly symbolic, perhaps even more so than substantive matter, a real make it or break it moment of whether ultimately out of this crisis, European Union is going to come out stronger or whether it will fall altogether.
Something we will be following very closely indeed. Just one last question on a more broader note. To what extent do you think has this crisis shed a light on the limits to our current global supply chain systems?
Well, essentially, there is indeed a risk that this crisis will see an end to globalization as we have known it. It has been an economic system which very much sort of focused on efficiency and therefore tried to reduce to the extent possible redundancies. And of course, we have seen the weaknesses of this system. Now, the challenge, I think, in my view, is going to be that of obviously avoiding reverting to a permanent rather than obviously simply temporary solution of closure. But I think it's going to be inevitable to see a globalization that perhaps relies more on the regional level, and therefore where global supply chains are going to be shorter than what have been so far, where redundancies are probably going to be part of life, because indeed they become an essential feature of the security of supplies. But so it is going to be a differently open system. And I think the challenge is going to make sure that although it is different, it remains an open economic system.
All right, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much, Nathalie Tocci from the Italian Institute of International Affairs.